introduce Fred Lifton and Lauren Rother here from Puppet to talk about internal process documentation and getting ready to expose it to the world.
Awesome. I can just do Fred. Hi, you can hear me okay? Awesome. So I'm Lauren Rother. I function largely in words and don't really have slides for you. So please enjoy this photo of a sloth, instead, because sloths, unlike honey badgers, give a shit. And so do I. So I'm a tech writer at Puppet Labs here in Portland. I must note that I'm a full-time writery tech writer in that I've never programmed, and I don't program at work. I read it, and that's fun. I come to you by way of a philosophy of language degree and years of freelance writing and editing. My coworker, Fred Lifton, and I are here to complicate the concept of audience and tell you what our challenges have been, how we've met those challenges, and which ones we're still bumping into. So it's a bit of a truism, but we all need users in order to exist, and a huge part of cultivating that user base is documentation. And that doesn't just mean external documentation. Internal people need to be able to use our software and products too, and that requires keeping the collective internal knowledge bases up to date. At Puppet Labs, we find most of our foundational audience is comprised of these external and internal users, and our primary challenge with this foundational audience is creating engaging, useful, and informative documentation. And successfully meeting all three of these criteria is actually pretty difficult in itself. Information that doesn't capture your attention and move you to the use of whatever we're writing about kind of makes us the philosophy major in the room who corners you with Kripke and modal logic. Not that I've ever done that, ever. And it might be interesting or even a little bit entertaining, but it's more likely encroaching on your space and taking up your time. So this multifaceted requirement of engaging, useful, and informative can be particularly hard when you consider that our audience has varying levels of skill and familiarity with whatever technology we're writing about. And it's a delicate balance to make sure that there's neither too much frosting for the hardcore tech people or too much density for the novices. But that's just the beginning. So Fred, my fellow tech writer, is going to complicate this initial framework by addressing additional levels of internal documentation needs.
Yeah, hi, hello. So my role at Puppet is as the doc lead for Puppet Enterprise, which is our big flagship product. I'm responsible for all of the documentation that has to do with Puppet Enterprise, internal and external. PE is a giant, huge, gnarly beast of an application. It has many, many moving parts, and I'm just one person. Which brings me to my first very, very important point. Puppet Labs is hiring a tech writer at the moment.
Yeah.
That's puppetlabs.com/company/careers. We're hiring a tech writer. So if anyone knows one, that'd be great. That said, my position regarding audience is kind of complicated. And it's complicated because the way we do things at Puppet is I'm actually embedded on the development team for PE. So that means that every day when I go to work, I go and I sit in the PE dev and developer area. I go out with beer and get beers with them when we have release days. I suffer with them when there's bugs. I'm basically part of the development team. I go to retrospectives. I go to planning meetings. So my understanding of the software starts from the developer's perspective. I know the user stories, I know why they came up with those user stories, and I know what things they tried to develop in order to give those stories happy endings. That also means that my writing tasks aren't limited to the kind of usual sort of user-facing documentation of manuals and FAQs and so on and so forth. I actually get to contribute to the software itself. I write UI strings, tooltips, all that kind of stuff. So in a very real way, I'm focused on the user from the developer's point of view. I have to sort of think like a UX engineer sometimes in order to get my writing work done. I also serve as the team librarian. As we have heard multiple times, teams produce a lot of internal documentation, and we feel pretty strongly that somebody needs to be in charge of all that documentation. You need to be a curator of that documentation library. And I don't mean curator like in the Portlandia sense of I collect pickles or vintage bike tires or something like that. You really have to work at keeping things up to date, making sure that the stuff in there is useful, and that means talking to the developers a lot, looking for holes, and then getting the developers to fill in some of those holes themselves. A similar act of curation comes with, we have something at Puppet called the predocs repo, and that's our GitHub repo where developers can put in stuff that they feel needs to get documented in the next version of the documents. But it's a sandbox where they can play and not worry about grammar Nazis or using semicolons incorrectly or anything like that. They can just put in whatever needs to go in and leave the writing up to the pros. And part of that act of curation means not just thinking about the current needs of the developers, but also thinking or the current needs of the developers on the team, but also thinking about developers outside that team who may need visibility into what we're doing and how we're doing it on the PE team. And it also means thinking about the needs of future developers when they come on board who are going to want to know, what did you guys do? What did you build? How did you build it? So I need to stay on top of that library, basically. So that's sort of half of my job. The other half of my job is to create user-facing documentation. And that, as you might imagine, is actually really influenced by how I deal with all this internal documentation. It's not that I can just take these documents in the library, turn around, neaten them up, throw in some screenshots, make sure all the semicolons are correct, huck it out into the wild and call it good. It's more like if you were, say, a philosophy major and you took an American Lit class at some point, that class might inform your senior thesis, and you might take some of those ideas or concepts or points of view and put them into your thesis. It's sort of the same thing with how my internal docs end up influencing my external docs. I can see the problems and the paradigms, and I know the ways that the devs were thinking about these things, and I can use that to sort of have empathy for the users that I know are going to be reading my external docs. So there's multiple ways in which my internal docs influence the external docs. They help me come up with information architecture. I know how to structure my docs because I know the main problems that the devs were trying to solve. So that is a pretty broad hint that those are the main things that my doc should focus on. Similarly, helps me make decisions about what to emphasize, why to emphasize it. It helps me know what I can safely leave out. Since I know who these users are, we've talked about them, we have personas, we've thought about them. So I know at least what we intend for them in terms of what level to pitch my documentation at. I know that our users are going to be technical and experienced at this level, so I can leave out a bunch of stuff. And finally, it helps me understand what sort of technical background I need to include in the documentation. If I know that our users are sysadmins, I probably don't need to spend a lot of time explaining Unix to them, hopefully. So I guess the way that this complicates audience for me is that even though I have sort of two different audiences, my experience with my internal audience is the experience that lets me sort of conjure, hopefully with clarity and with empathy, my external audience.
So my experience is slightly different because when I started at Puppet, I was brought on as an intern and given the task of writing READMEs for Puppet-produced modules on the Forge, which is our sort of module repository. But there was a caveat, which is that there was no template for READMEs, and I needed to create one. And that's where everything got immediately complicated. While the primary audience for Forge modules is system administrators, usually external system administrators, with some internal users and a few non-sysadmins thrown in, there's now another audience to consider, which is module authors. And this secondary audience is where things really got complicated, because the template I needed to create now had to be more than just a way to structure information so that module consumers it would be presentable to module consumers. Now it also had to be something that would entice developers who are writing new modules to use it. And by developers, it's extra complicated, because I don't just mean people who are developing for Puppet every day, but people who maybe just started programming with Puppet and doing things in Puppet. And whatever I ended up creating, they all needed to agree to fill out the various sections of the template and to fill it out in such a way that the people who may not be programmers at all could understand how to interact with whatever they just built, which is really hard, as it turns out. And so here, just to recap, I have this primary audience that at varying levels of skill needs basic instructions on how to interact with a given module in their particular environment. And I have a secondary audience that I must get to participate who has limited time, is at varying levels of confidence in their own writing abilities, and is highly adverse to duplicating efforts. Honestly, the amount of times I've heard the suggestion, why don't you just pull all of my comments out of my code and plunk it in a doc? Could fill up a Foster Wallace novel. And I get where it comes from. It's very sweet. But also, like, how do I nicely tell you, like, that only really works if your comments are good or they're at all? Yeah. Not that I've said that either. I identified pretty early on that in order to address these needs, these interwoven needs, there were two things I absolutely had to do. And the first was narrow every piece of the template into simple, flexible topic headings that could be expanded or contracted based on the kind of module. Some are huge and some are really tiny. And then two, I had to get really comfortable messing up. With so many people weighing in, it became apparent that the template was going to have to go through several iterations before I really hit the balance. And in the process of those iterations, there was going to be a lot of grumbling. And there was a lot of grumbling, a whole lot of grumbling. My biggest challenge ended up being phrasing, choosing words for topic headers that made sense both to the consumers and the actual developers. It turns out that there are a few words that I think mean one thing and that mean different things for developers. That was really fun learning. And the other thing the biggest challenge I think I honestly had was structure, which is how do I find a way to develop a sensical educational flow to this template and the resulting README. And there were varying opinions on how this would work. And some of it was because you're talking to the devs and the experienced users and the new users, and some of them want these bare bones referential, here are all of my classes, and some want this very hand-holding, like step-by-step, we're buddies approach. And ultimately, we ended up in the middle. I created a README table of contents with linked headers so that skimming or skipping through the content was easy, and all of the important information, 30-second elevator pitch on what this module does, all of the things in your system that it touches is up at the front. But I also met these challenges in a few different ways. Incorporated user testing. When I started the project, there was already quite a lot of user testing that had been done by our amazing UX team. And this actually really gave me an insight into what sort of information our external consumers would like to see when they're considering using a module. And this helped immensely to keep the overall goal for the README project focused, and also helped my many, many discussions with developers, which was my second step. I had a lot of discussions with developers and external users, all of which started because I made a concentrated effort to release drafts of my template for comments at each stage. And this allowed for ongoing changes and additions to be made, both as I documented larger and smaller modules, and as people tested using the template and got back to me with, this didn't make any sense, or I didn't know quite what to put here. And third, this really meant that I stayed really super flexible. And it's this last piece that ultimately made all of the difference for me when working with complicated audience. And I'm going to get super cheesy for a second here. When I set an overall goal and focus for the project, it's imperative to successfully pass through the forest. That's the goal. But in the middle of the trees, when you're making your way through the forest, it's equally important to be able to go right or left as your journey unfolds. And it is cheesy, but it's no less true for being cheesy. Being able and willing to make adjustments, even huge ones, as the breadth of the work unfolds, was really valuable to my work and continues to be really valuable to my work at Puppet. Which is not to say our process is without its flaws. At present, we're still completely flummoxed as to how best sort and address external user contributions, let alone how best to invite it and where is best to invite it. Internationalization is a topic that comes up about every 3 weeks, and we all have feelings about it and then kind of hide from it for a little bit longer. Baked-in documentation is another one of those things. How do you maintain baked-in documentation that then may need to be translated or is going to change based on versions? And those are just a few. I hope that sharing our growing pains and our challenges brings to light that we aren't always writing for one stalwart audience, but often for a multi-tiered, complex audience that may only become apparent how complex it is over time. Thanks, and we're happy to answer any questions. Questions? Nope. Yes, no? Yeah?
I want to know the words.
The question was, I want to know the words.